somewhat surreal to appear on the same platform St. John appeared on because our paths intertwined. I was awakened by a phone call at 3:05 a.m. on June 17, 1972, and it was Howard Hunt, his father, calling me from the White House office, saying he wanted to come to my residence, which was about a mile away from the White House and from Watergate. And could I see him? And I said, sure, come ahead. And he came and arrived at about 3:35. I'm being very specific because I had to testify about all this before the grand jury. And he explained to me what had happened, the arrest at Watergate and so forth. And he wanted to retain me as his attorney. And he called ordinary to my place and ordinary retained me as attorney, retained me as his attorney, and to represent also those that had been arrested. Then Howard departed, and he went home, and you just heard from St. John how he was awakened and asked to put these things in the car and went out and put it in the Chesapeake Canal and so forth. And so both, and then Howard disappeared 2 days later. He disappeared for 3 weeks. So he handed me this case, which was a tremendous case, and he just disappeared. Nobody knew where he was. I didn't know where he was. But he had been told by John Dean through Gordon Liddy that he had to go out of town. And so he went out of town. And I was handling the case. Watergate we can discuss in great length, but we're not going to do that tonight. But I just want to point out some highlights. That on June 28th, which was about a week after Watergate broke, I was in the courthouse, and I was handed a grand jury subpoena by one of the assistant U.S. attorneys to appear forthwith before the grand jury. And he grabbed my arm, and I went before the grand jury. And then a week later, in open court, Silbert, who was a prosecutor, accused me of obstruction of justice. And 5 days later, Judge Sirica accused me in open court of being a principal in the crime and ordered me to testify, or else I'd be held in contempt and confined, incarcerated. And of course, I was just the defense attorney. I was not involved in any way at all. But I refused to testify because of the attorney-client privilege, and Judge Sirica incarcerated me. The Court of Appeals released me, and I ultimately did testify before the grand jury to answer all the questions that Judge Sirica wanted answered. But in the meanwhile, the 4th of July weekend, I was contacted by a person who called himself Mr. Rivers, and I was the first person approached for the hush money. And I turned it down after conferring with I was just an attorney in a law firm. I was not a partner. I confirmed with the partners in my law firm. They said, well, we don't know what this is all about, but we can't do that. We can't get involved in that. So I turned it down, and this ultimately came out that it was Anthony Lasowitz who was distributing the hush money. He eventually found an attorney who did take it after I had turned it down. But this is discussed in the Oval Office tapes between President Nixon, not the hush money because he didn't know about it, about my role in Watergate. He was aghast. President Nixon was saying, what is Judge Sirica doing incarcerating this attorney, holding him in contempt and so forth? He and Ehrlichman are talking back and forth on July 19th, 1972. And I did go before the grand jury. I answered their questions. And strange enough, when I tried to explain that I've been approached with the hush money, that's when the prosecutors cut me off. They didn't want to hear that. They didn't want to hear that. They were under their own instructions. They were the ones engaged in obstruction of justice, not me. And ultimately, as it worked out, I was not named I was never indicted. I was not an unindicted co-conspirator. I was never disciplined by the bar. I was never sued by the Democratic National Committee, though my deposition was taken by Edward Bennett Williams. So these false accusations by Earl Silbert, who wanted to become U.S. Attorney, that was his goal, and by Judge Sirica, who wanted to take this case and deny the defendants a fair trial. Howard Hunt talks about this in his book. He went on to be named Man of the Year, and he got $1 million to write a book called To Set the Record Straight. He never mentions me in his book. He never set the record straight about that. Judge Sirica, in my opinion, was corrupt. He was a corrupt judge who took this case to himself because he wanted to become famous. These people in Washington, that's all about they think about. They just think about how can we turn these tragedies, these national dilemmas, so to speak, to our own advantage. But I just wanted to mention that as a background to what St. John had talked about, because his father never got a fair trial. His father never got a fair trial, and Judge Sirica was the cause of it. Now, I'm under contract with Prime Day to write my biography, which is called Being There. Being There. I'm really not a researcher. It's just that I've been there, so to speak, in a number of instances. And I'm here today to talk about representing Willis Celestis when he disclosed everything, not everything, but a great deal of what he knew. But I was his attorney, I want to, before I do that, I want to provide a little bit of background of how I got there. In 1954, I was in high school, and this is part of being there. And there was a rally I was in high school in New Orleans. There was a rally in Auburn Park for Joe McCarthy. And my family was very strong supporters of Joe McCarthy, so I went over there. And Kent Phoebe Courtney, who organized that rally, said, well, you set up a card table in the French Quarter and collect signatures to support Joe McCarthy, and I agreed to do that. And I collected signatures in the park just opposite the cathedral there, St. Louis Cathedral. We got lots of signatures. Joe McCarthy was Catholic, and there were a lot of sympathizers coming in and out of that church. But as a result of that, Tim Courtney said, well, come to a meeting. I want you to meet Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister at that time was the assistant supervisor of the New Orleans police. So we went to his office, and I met with Guy Bannister 3 or 4 times at different meetings. This was to discuss organized crime in New Orleans. And ultimately, I appeared on a platform with Guy Bannister and Medford Evans. You can find this on the internet about 1959. But this all occurred when I was still in high school. This was 1955. So I was in high school. Guy Bannister had his office just off Canal Street. He was still with the police department at that time. Later in the week, he became a private detective. And guess who was living a 5-minute walk from his office in the French Quarter? Lee Harvey Oswald. He was going to high school, as I was going to high school. So in 1955, all 3 of us were within walking distance of each other, but none of us knew what the future held. Oswald did not know what the future held for him. Guy Bannister later on became his handler. I believe it was his handler just before what happened in Dallas. You know, there's a relationship in New Orleans between Bannister and Oswald. And I came to represent Hunt and the Cuban Americans in Watergate. And of course they were involved, as St. John talked about, in the Kennedy assassination too. But none of us knew in 1955 that this was going to take place. And so when I was graduated from high school, I went to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and I started working for a Human Events newsletter. And a friend of mine said, well, we were talking, he said, there's no conservative movement. There was no conservative movement in those days. Liberalism reigned supreme. So we thought, well, we'll start with the students. We formed the National Student Committee for the Loyalty Oath, which was to keep the loyalty oath of the National Defense Education Act. Senator Kennedy wanted it removed. But that got us in touch with a number of other students around the country who were interested in that. And there is an article in the New Republic by Gerald Johnson at the time attacking us as students for forming this committee. He claimed we were asking for civility, but no, we wanted to emphasize patriotism. But that was somewhat successful, and Senator Stiles Bridges delivered a speech on the floor of the Senate about our organization. And the next year we formed Youth for Goldwater for Vice President. Next one was going to be the nominee, and for president, and so we formed it for vice president. Goldwater would not have wanted us to form it for president, and we formed it for vice president. And I was graduated in 1960 and went to New York City, and I started working. I was graduated from Georgetown. I started working for Marvin Lehman Associates, who had among the clients Governor Charles Edison. Charles Edison was Thomas Edison's son. He was a former governor of New Jersey, under Secretary of the Navy under Roosevelt, and he was chairman of the McGraw-Edison Company. And what my assignment was to work with him in a public affairs program for McGraw-Edison. But Marvin Lehman said, well, Doug, you have this Youth for Goldwater organization for vice president, and Governor Edison says he will underwrite the cost of opening an office in Chicago at the Big Congress Hotel at the Republican Convention in 1960, and that's what we did. We opened an office, and Goldwater came to our office and said, don't let this organization die, and William F. Buckley was there. I'd written for National Review when I was still at Georgetown. He was a close friend of mine, and Buckley said, well, I'm volunteering our family home in Sharon, Connecticut, if you want to found a national youth organization. And so we founded Young Americans for Freedom in September of 1960. In March of 1961, we held the first mass conservative rally at Manhattan Center, and in 1962 at Madison Square Garden. Up until then, there never had been a conservative movement in the country. And it caught the eyes of the politicians who became a major force. The highlight for me was that there was an interview between of Goldwater. It's called Goldwater, a liberal interviews Senator Goldwater. Goldwater was just emerging as a force in this country, and Goldwater went out of his way to praise me for the work I had done for Youth for Goldwater and setting up Young Americans for Freedom. But I had to go into the Army. I volunteered to do so at that time. I feared I was going to be drafted, so I volunteered. And they had a program those days, 6 months active duty and 7.5 years in reserves, and that's what I did. When I came out, I enrolled in New York University Law School, and Lieutenant Governor Malcolm Wilson of New York, who was a conservative, offered me a job. And to work in the daytime, I worked for him, and in the evening I went to law school at NYU. And Malcolm Wilson had his office in Governor Rockefeller's office at 22 West 55th Street. That was a private office. There were only 30 people in there. And it was really the center of the Rockefeller operation. But Malcolm Wilson, Lieutenant Governor, had his office on the top floor, the 5th floor. And the highlight there was I got a phone call on November 22nd, 1963, from a friend of mine on Wall Street, a fellow student at law school, who said, Doug, he said, Kennedy's been assassinated in Dallas. He said, I got it, and he hung up. So I walked, Lieutenant Governor Wilson's office was about 30 feet away. I said, Lieutenant Governor Wilson, Kennedy's been assassinated. He said, go downstairs to the press room. So I went down to the press room, and the press secretary was at lunch. But the secretary was there, and I said, well, Kennedy's been assassinated. And she said, well, what? But she pointed to a closet, and there was a telex machine in the closet. In those days, the news was printed out, and this kept going all the time, printing out the news, in this big yellow stream of paper. And if there was something important, the bells were ringing. Well, of course, the bells were ringing off the hook. At that point, the secretary called the press secretary to come back to the office immediately. And what I did was I walked through that townhouse. There were only about 30 people in there, telling them what had occurred. And that was the first time the Rockefeller organization knew of the Kennedy assassination. When I was graduated, I went to work for General Foods Corporation in New York. And I worked for there. I was really in charge of monitoring government affairs. And they said, we were going to send you to Washington. In 1969, we want you to open up our own office, but for the first year, we want you to work out of the Mullen Company. That's our PR firm down there. And so in 1969, I went down to Washington, D.C., and I started working out of the Mullen Company. And who should arrive 6 months later but Howard Hunt? He just had retired, and the head of the CIA had placed him in that office. And Howard Hunt and I started talking, and we realized that we had something in common. William F. Buckley was the godfather to his children, and I had a very close relationship with Buckley. So we became very close friends. I left General Foods employ and went with a law firm, and that's where I was when Watergate broke, and Howard Hunt retained me. There's a great deal of background information about all this, but I'm going to go ahead because we're really going to talk today about Lyndon Johnson, Mac Wallace, and so forth. I'll just jump ahead here and say after Watergate broke, I moved to Texas. My family was down here in Houston, and I've been here in Houston ever since. And the first year I was here, I was admitted to the bar. I was offered a job by George Strait. He was the Secretary of State in the Governor Clement's administration. And so I served really as Director of Elections for Texas. I traveled to almost all the counties. There are 254 counties in Texas, administering elections, teaching how it should be done, and so forth. And then after Reagan was elected, that was 1980, after Reagan was elected, I got a call from Howard Phillips of the Conservative Union, who said, the Moody Foundation out of Galveston, Texas wants to give us a grant, but it has to be to a Texas nonprofit organization. Would you form one? And I said, sure. And so I formed the Texas Policy Institute, and we got a grant from the Moody Foundation. And we put on a program in 1983 on Star Wars. Nobody was talking about Star Wars, but we brought in all these experts from Washington and talked about Star Wars. And but I started working with Sherman Moody on different projects, and one day he said, well, I just got a call from Jimmy Day, my former lobbyist, who's in prison in Midland, Texas. He was in prison not for something he'd done for Sherman, but something he'd done in Washington, D.C. Essentially, the way Sherman explained it, he went into the White House as a guest, and he took the stationery, stole the stationery from the White House and started writing letters of puffery, what was, how great he was, okay? And he ended up in prison for doing this. But anyway, he said, Jimmy Day said, I have right next to me, I have Billy Saul Estes. And Billy Saul Estes would like to talk to you. This is what Sherman Moody told me. Billy Saul said, this is 1983. And Lyndon Johnson had died in 1973, 10 years earlier. And Billy Saul said, well, I'm in prison, but I'll be getting out in about 6 to 8 months, and I want to tell what I know, and could the Moody Foundation give me a grant, arrange for a grant so I can tell what I know. And Sherman said, well, I'm going to send Doug Caddy up to talk to you. And so I flew up to Midland, Texas, to the federal prison there, and I met with Billy Saul Estes. And I said, well, after listening to him, I said, he wanted to tell everything he knew. I said, well, the way to do it is to write a book. He said, write a book. Okay, I'll think about it, okay? So that's the way I left him. He was going to think about it. He gave the idea to his daughter, Pam Estes, and she wrote a book, Billy Saul Estes, The King of the Wheeler Dealers, which got immense publicity. That was the media was very interested in this. Nationwide media was very interested in this. But she only knew the story from the viewpoint of the family. She really didn't know any of the criminal activities and so forth. So when Billy Saul was released from prison at the end of 1983, he contacted Sherman Moody and said, well, I want to proceed ahead, I want to write my own book. And so Sherman Moody sent me up there to meet with Billy Saul Estes, and Sherman, before I departed, Sherman said, I can get a grant, a $500,000 grant from the Moody Foundation, but we have to have an entity to give it to. We can't just give it to Billy Saul. But Billy Saul was a member of the Church of Christ. Actually, I was raised in the Church of Christ myself, though I'm an Episcopalian now. And he was a member of the Church of Christ, and in Abilene was the Abilene Christian College, which is a Church of Christ institution. So we went over there and visited the president, and the president said, well, we're receptive to receiving a grant from the Moody Foundation. In fact, there was an auditorium on the campus, I think, that said Moody Auditorium, so they had previously received money. And so the arrangement was that Abilene Christian College would get $400,000 of the $500,000 grant, and Billy Saul Estes would get $100,000. Okay, and but meanwhile, Billy Saul introduced me to U.S. Marshal Ken Peoples. Ken Peoples was a Texas Ranger and then became a U.S. Marshal, and for 25 years he had followed LBJ, he had followed Billy Saul Estes. Actually, they were had a very close relationship. And so I started working with Ken Peoples, coordinating with him. But unbeknownst to me, they never informed me, Ken Peoples worked it out with Billy Saul, that Billy Saul would appear before the grand jury, the local grand jury in Robertson County, which he did in 1984, and which he disclosed what had happened with the killing of Henry Marshall, which was one of the people that had been Lyndon Johnson had ordered to be killed. And as a result of his testimony before the grand jury in Robertson County, the death of Henry Marshall, who was a U.S. government employee, an agriculture employee, was changed from suicide in 1961 when he was murdered. Actually, when he was murdered, LBJ arranged for it to be suicide to homicide in 1984. And while working with the grants from the Moody Foundation, we had another organization called Investigative Research Foundation, and we were going to put on a conference on terrorism, and a friend of mine in New York City, who was a retired FBI agent, said, well, you should be working with Edward Miller. I said, who is he? He said, he's a former assistant director of the FBI. So I started working with Edward Miller, and Edward Miller became very interested in the Billy Saul Estes case, and Billy Saul had said to me, well, for me to write my story, I have to have immunity. I have to have immunity from the federal government. And so I told this to Edward Miller, and Edward Miller says, well, I can get us in to see the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. I mean, he's the top guy who makes decisions of who's prosecuted or not. And because it was Stephen Trollope, the Assistant Attorney General, who had gotten a pardon for Edward Miller when both he and Mark Hilt had been convicted as FBI agents for COINTELPRO for the black bag jobs. President Reagan, the day he was shot, was ready to sign their pardon, but when he came back to his office 6 weeks later after recovery, he signed that pardon. And so Edward Miller had a close relationship with Stephen Trollope. We went and saw him, and he said, I need a letter of proffer from Billy Saul Estes as to what he'll tell us if we consider immunity. And so, how many people in this room have read my letter on the internet that I wrote? Okay, 3 or 4. Well, essentially, it's a 4-page letter, but I'm just going to read the key part. Everything but that, okay? Essentially, in the letter, Billy Saul Estes outlined 7 people that were killed. It was a cabal, 7 people that were killed. It was a cabal of Lyndon Johnson, Cliff Carter, Mac Wallace, and Billy Saul Estes. And they had to eliminate certain people along the way. The first person they killed was John Kinzer. They killed John Kinzer in 1951 by agreement. He was in Austin. He ran a golf shop. He had a relationship with Josephia, who was Lyndon Johnson's sister, and it's my belief and Billy Saul Estes' belief that Kinzer was killed because Josephia told him too much about Lyndon Johnson, who at that time was a senator, was up to, and Johnson was livid about this. And so he was killed, and he was caught trying to escape Austin, and he stood trial and was convicted of homicide of forethought, and he got a suspended sentence. That was part of the whole Lyndon Johnson operation. His lawyer was Jon Coker, okay? And so that was the first. I'm only going to talk about 3 of the 7 cases. Another case was Henry Marshall that I just talked about. He was killed in 1961. Kinzer was killed in 1951, and Marshall was killed in 1961. And eventually, because of what Billy Saul testified before the grand jury in '84, it was reversed from suicide to homicide. And Billy Saul testified it was Mac Wallace who had done this. Now, Mac Wallace was an interesting person, and this is a book that Joan Mullen has just, she's speaking at the Lancer conference, by the way. This is her new book that just came out. And in many ways, it's a superb book for the first 2/3. My only disagreement is the last 1/3, where she talks about Billy Saul Estes and Mac Wallace's fingerprints. Because there is the allegation that one of his fingerprints was found on that box on the 6th floor. And we have Bar McClellan right here, who is an expert on that subject, and tomorrow Richard Bartholomew is going to be talking about this. And it's the opinion of Joan Mullen that this is not Mac Wallace's fingerprint at all. And she goes at great length to explain why she so believes, and she backs up with her evidence. But it's still controversial because on the education forum, the JFK Assassination forum, on the education forum, I started a topic on August 31 this year, a review of Joan Mullen's book, and I encourage you to go there and read that. You can just Google review of Joan Mullen's book on LBJ on the education forum, and you'll bring up a discussion among the members, and they bring forth all sorts of evidence to show that this is Mac Wallace's fingerprint on that box on the 6th floor. So it's still an open question. Not only that, but right after John Mellon's book was published, Robert Caro announced that he has a forthcoming volume that he's writing. You know, in his last volume, he never mentioned Billy Saul Estes and or Mac Wallace. There's no mention of them whatsoever. In his final volume, he's going to talk about both of those and other things too, Bobby Baker and so forth. And so Joan has written a very good book, except for where I think she has departed from is on Billy Saul Estes and on the fingerprint. The final victim I'm going to just talk about very briefly was Josephia, Lyndon Johnson's sister. Billy Saul Estes told me that Josephia was murdered in 1961 on Christmas Eve at the ranch. That Lyndon gave her a cut portion of the Christmas cake that had poison in it, and that she died the next day. Okay, and here's her death certificate, and sure enough, she died on Christmas Day. And sure enough, she was buried the next day, December 26th. And where was she buried? At the Johnson Cemetery on the Johnson Ranch. It was done very, very quickly. Now why? Because she was talking to him. She was talking too much. Here was 1960, was vice president. She was a threat to all his ambitions to become president. And so that's another one of the persons that Billy Saul Estes told me about. Now the question is raised is the credibility of Billy Saul Estes. All I can say is that I had several meetings. I had about 7 meetings with Billy Saul Estes, and I came to believe that what he told me was the truth. That it was the truth, and that he wanted to tell the truth. And what happened in regard to his getting immunity from the Justice Department was that after he testified before the Robert grand jury and had all this publicity, Abilene Christian University backed out. They said they cannot accept that grant, it was just too controversial. We didn't have another organization that could take it. But then the question also arose about, I talked to U.S. Marshal Ken Peoples. He said, well, we think, Peoples thought there was another family member involved, not in the murders, but in Billy Saul's many criminal activities. By opening this up, they might bring another family member into the situation. But there was another aspect, and it's not covered by Joan in her book, and that is that for Billy Saul to have gotten immunity, he could have perhaps gotten immunity from the federal government, but he got immunity from the district attorney in Robertson County, but all these murders that took place in different counties around Texas and also in New Mexico, and he would have to get immunity from the district attorneys in each of those counties before he could testify. And I can tell you right now, the Johnson people still had enough influence that they would have stopped that. They would never have let him get the immunity in those other counties. So that's a major reason why he was unable to pursue in telling what he knew. I'm the only person he ever really disclosed a great deal to, one of the things he disclosed to me, which is not in my letter, there's several things that Joan Mellon misses in her book. By the way, she interviewed me for the book. She called me on the phone and we talked, and then we had maybe 3 or 4 conversations on the phone and maybe 4 or 5 exchanges of emails. And she talks about this in her book. And she quotes me and so forth, but essentially I was the key person. I'm the only person Billy Saul has ever talked about Mac Wallace and what he did for Lyndon Johnson. And she should have actually come to Texas and sat down with me on one of her trips to Texas and said, what do you know? I would gladly have told her everything I knew. Because really my position on all these things is I have oral history. I'm not a researcher. I was just there basically in these different things. And so I would have told her what I knew. And or we could have done it by Skype. But instead she had this preconceived idea. When our first telephone conversation, she said that she thought that Mac Wallace had been misrepresented. He was sort of a fall guy. And so her book is sort of she goes into the personal history of Mac Wallace a great deal. And you can see he was a very interesting person. But she went in there with the idea ahead of time to show that he wasn't, other than maybe involved in the Kinzer murder, for which he was convicted, which she says on page 14 at the beginning of her book, not at the end, she says, Mac Wallace is a case in point. His history with Lyndon Johnson, a window into Johnson's methods. Wallace's story is so intriguing because, unlike other of Johnson's acolytes, it is difficult to prove what he did for Lyndon Johnson, or what Lyndon Johnson in turn did for him. More than any of the other Johnson proteges and acolytes, Wallace's connection to him remains cloaked in secrecy. So she really undercuts her final argument. She's saying, we really don't know what Mac Wallace did for Johnson. So I will support her statement at the beginning of her book, as opposed to what she includes at the end. There's several things she also fails, because she never interviewed me, she fails to mention, and that is that Billy Saul said that the way Mac Wallace committed the murders, and I can see in my mind's eye, I can see Billy Saul turning and saying this to me, and he was completely candid. I can tell you that he was completely honest. He said, Mac Wallace was flown on a military plane. Lyndon Johnson arranged for him to be flown on a military plane. The pilots didn't know. They just had an assignment, transport this important person to this place, wait, and then fly him back to Washington or elsewhere. And that's how it took place. It was a military plane. It was done. That's how it took place. All the murders took place. And so Professor Joe Millen attempts to prove that Mac Wallace was in California on the day of the assassination of Kennedy, or on the day of the assassination of Henry Marshall in Robertson County. But if the military was a plane and was involved, it could still have been in both places on the same day, put it that way. He still could have had an excuse. There's another important factor which she does bring out, and which I want to emphasize, which is that there are two lawyers that are involved with Lyndon Johnson. One of them is Jon Coker. Jon Coker was a key player for Lyndon Johnson. He was the person here. Jon Coker and Abe Fortas were the two lawyers who saw that Johnson got elected to the U.S. Senate in the famous Box 13 case that everybody knows about in Jim Wells County. Jon Coker and Abe Fortas. And Jon Coker at the Kinzer trial represented Mac Wallace. And Jon Coker represented Billy Saul in both of his trials. And where else did John Kinzer represent Billy Saul? And Joan Mellon does not get into this in the book, but one thing that Billy Saul told me was that he gave a $500,000 bribe to U.S. Supreme Court Tom Clark. Tom Clark came out of Dallas. He was one of the Texas boys, okay? He was on the Supreme Court. And Jon Coker and Billy Saul met Johnson on his plane, and from what I read into what Billy Saul was telling me, it was Johnson who carried the money to Tom Clark. And what happened was, Billy Saul was convicted in the state of Texas on a securities case, and it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court reversed, he was convicted, and the Supreme Court reversed his conviction. And in 1965, and who wrote the decision reversing his conviction? They reversed it on the basis that because his trial was televised, he did not get a fair trial. Who wrote the decision? Justice Clark. Justice Clark. Who wrote it? Now, it's shocking that a U.S. Supreme Court justice would take a bribe. Isn't it shocking? But let's examine Abe Fortas. Johnson nominated Abe Fortas to the Supreme Court in 1965. And then when Earl Warren wanted to retire, he wanted Abe Fortas to become the Chief Justice. And in the process of considering him for Chief Justice, it was disclosed that he had taken money outside his salary as a justice from American University. And so his promotion to Chief Justice was torpedoed. A year later, it was disclosed that Abe Fortas was receiving money from the Wolfson Foundation out of New York. He had a retainer who'd be paid $15,000. This is in the 1960s. He paid $15,000 for the remainder of for his whole life. Okay. At that point, the uproar was so great that Abe Fortas had to resign. So there are two justices on the Supreme Court who are linked to Lyndon Johnson, and both of them were involved in corruption. One of them was Tom Clark, and one of them was Abe Fortas. And one of my heroes is Ramsey Clark. Ramsey Clark, when Robert Kennedy was no longer Attorney General under Johnson's administration, Johnson appointed Ramsey Clark. And when Ramsey Clark left and went into private practice, he represented many worthwhile organizations, and he's one of my heroes. I don't think Ramsey Clark had any idea of what I'm talking about today. He is a very honorable and a great lawyer. But that is how Lyndon Johnson operated in those days. The bottom line really is that, in my opinion, that I don't think that Johnson. I put it this way: when Johnson was named vice president and was elected, I think he had the intention of making sure he'd become president in the next 4 years. He had that intention. And there is a statement by Bobby Baker to John Reynolds at the inauguration, where Bobby Baker says to John Reynolds, Bobby Baker, was LBJ's closest advisor in Washington, his go-go man. He said at the Kennedy inauguration, he'll never serve out his term, he'll die a violent death. Don Reynolds testified to that. But I think what happened at the Bay of Pigs is that JFK, when JFK fired Allen Dulles and Jennifer Ball and several others, that's when the decision was made by the deep state that JFK had to go. And so Lyndon Johnson, in my opinion, was probably aware of what was going to happen, but he was not really the figurehead at the top. He was not the one pulling the strings and so forth. But he did have an assignment. His assignment was the cover-up, which he did very well. And he had a very close assistance in doing that was J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was his next door neighbor in Washington when Johnson was U.S. Senator. They were very close together. And so Johnson's role was a cover-up, though I really believe it was the deep state that determined that JFK had to be killed. So I have 5 more minutes left, so I'll entertain any questions you may want. I apologize because I'm really giving you just the essence of so much more. There's so much more here, but I'm giving you the essence today. Any questions?
I'm sorry, microphone. Wasn't Ramsey Clark installed by Johnson to discredit Jim Garrison?
Was it Ramsey Clark?
I thought Ramsey Clark went around a lot of talk shows to discredit Jim Garrison.
To discredit Jim, was he appointed to discredit Jim Garrison?
Ramsey Clark.
Discredit Jim Garrison.
Okay. That was while he was Attorney General?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not to listen to them.
The other question is, I talked to Billy Hall about this, was
Right.
these famous audio tapes that he made
Right.
for the last 2 years preceding the assassination, because he saw how many people Johnson was knocking off, and
Right.
he knew too much, and et cetera. Now, I got into a big argument with his daughter Pam about the tapes, and first they exist, then they don't exist, and I was just wondering,
Well, Pam is deceased, as you know.
yes.
Yeah, so,
This is a couple of years ago.
right, yeah.
Do you think, did you ever talk to Billy about the tape?
Oh, yeah, I talked with Billy about, I never heard the tapes I talked about. He was very adamant about that. And he, in his letter to the Justice Department, he names a fellow, Kyle Brown, who knew about the tapes and so forth. But I don't know anything about the tapes other than what he told me.
So they could exist, or they could be,
They could or they could not, I just don't know.
yeah.
But I do think this, that Billy Saul would have been killed a long time ago if he did not have something to protect himself. It may have been the tapes, it may have been something else. But, you know, they killed Mac Wallace, they ran his car off the road. They killed 10 people, they ran his car off the road. And Pam always told me when I was working with Billy Saul, we're so scared that he's going to be killed, we're so scared he's going to be killed. No.
One last quick question. I've read this, and maybe it's not fair, maybe you covered it earlier, but there's about this situation of you being picked as the attorney for the Watergate situation,
Yeah.
and you would read things like, well, he was a corporate attorney, what was he doing in this setting, sort of thing. And
I was there because of the Moody Foundation. I was representing the Moody Foundation. They wanted to give a grant to Billy Saul Estes.
no, not Billy Saul, but Watergate.
Okay, what about Watergate?
Weren't you were representing,
Yeah, Hunt and Liddy and,
yeah, right.
yeah, all of them.
So the question that this writer was asking, why does a corporate attorney go from corporate law to criminal litigation? It's two different fields. Really.
Why was I involved in two different situations?
Well, into the second one mainly. I mean,
Billy Saul case?
no, to Watergate.
Watergate.
Who called you in on the Watergate to represent those guys?
I thought, okay, Howard Hunt called me from his office in the White House, and on 3:05 a.m. on June 17th, Howard Hunt, and then Gordon Liddy, he talked to Gordon Liddy, and they both retained me. And I represented them and the arrested individuals too. And